An aircraft carrier's mission can last for months with about 5,000 sailors on board. It's incredibly vulnerable to attacks from enemies. Therefore, there's a high probability of somebody dying on board. The famous flight deck, where planes take off and land, is also used for funeral ceremonies when somebody dies on board. Some people choose to be buried at sea and have had their ashes scattered as well. The ashes are put in a recyclable urn and spread out in the water. It's not common for U.S. Navy soldiers who've died to be buried on an aircraft carrier. It's not common for the U.S. military to burn the bodies of soldiers who have died in action. Instead, U.S. Navy soldiers who have died are usually buried at sea or brought back to land to be buried in a cemetery. Putting people to rest at sea is not only an old custom, but is still done today. In the past, ships didn't have anywhere to keep their dead soldiers during wartime. So their bodies were stuffed into heavy shrouds, which were generally made of sailcloth, and thrown into the ocean. World War II was the last time such a large burial took place at sea. There's still a lot of service members, soldiers, and family members who choose this method today. Burial at sea is a proper way to honor those who died serving their country. There are military honors at the event, such as the rifle salute and the playing of taps. The ceremony may be held differently based on the person's rank, service history, and personal wishes. Burial at sea for a dead U.S. Navy sailor is a solemn and respectful ceremony that takes several steps and is done with the greatest respect for the dead. The body is taken to the ship's fantail, where it's put on a canvas pile and slid into the water after the rite. The crew of the vessel salutes and rings the bell as the body goes into the water. After that, the body is left to sink to the ocean floor. If the dead person needs to be taken to land while the aircraft carrier is at sea, the body is put in a body bag and kept in a freezer, which sailors call a reefer. This method of keeping is meant to keep the body safe until it can be taken to a morgue. The dead person can be taken to a medical examiner in 2 days, as long as the ship is not at war or in a fight. In that case, the body could be kept for weeks or even months. The sailors buried at sea, though, if no one asked for the body to be brought to land. You might not believe that an airplane was used as a coffin, that the US government played the Soviet national anthem during one burial at sea and then kept the story secret for 36 years. The most military families choose to cremate the body before the ceremony. That the Navy made an exception when burying astronaut Neil Armstrong at sea, and what it takes for somebody's body to be buried underwater at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy buries about 1,500 people at sea every year, but only about 15 of them are buried in a box. Since most of the ceremonies take place on U.S. Navy boats that are out at sea, families may have to wait 12 to 18 months for their loved ones' bodies to make it into the water. While the funeral itself is free, families do have to pay to have the body moved and stored for a while. And because keeping the body in a freezer for more than a year costs a lot of money, many people choose to cremate the bodies while they wait their turn. The final disposition of remains takes place on board deployed U.S. Navy warships, so family members are not allowed to attend the burial ceremony. Instead, the family will receive notification from the warship's commanding officer regarding the date, time, longitude, and latitude of the committed service. They will also receive a handwritten letter from the captain and any pictures or videos. If the family had provided a flag, it would also be returned, and depending on the ship, the family may receive 3 shell casings from the 3-volley salute, though this will vary from ship to ship. The family may have to wait months after the ceremony to receive these items, because the ship must return from deployment first. However, as with all rules, there are a few exceptions. When Neil Armstrong was buried at sea, why did they do it? Neil Armstrong may be the only person who was born on land, walked on the moon, and was buried at sea. His burial service was held aboard the USS Philippines Sea on September 14, 2012. Now, the exception wasn't that an astronaut had gotten a burial at sea. Armstrong was also a U.S. Navy pilot, making him qualified for this ceremony. The exception was that Neil's family was allowed to be present during the funeral. In fact, the astronaut's wife, Carol Armstrong, along with U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Paul Nagy, committed the ashes of Neil Armstrong to the Atlantic Ocean. Who can be buried at sea by the Navy? Today, most people are buried at sea are retired sailors or sailors who are released with honor. Very rarely does a current duty service member get this ceremony. In fact, a morgue is where the bodies of active duty military members are kept if they die while on duty. If the ship doesn't have a morgue, the body is put in a freezer until it can be taken back to shore. Submariners call this an ice cream party. But what happens if somebody dies on a submarine? While it's on patrol, ideally the submarine would rise as quickly as possible so the body could be airlifted with a helicopter to a naval ship nearby. This isn't always possible though, especially when a very important mission is going on. In that case, it could take days or even weeks before the body can be moved. This means the deceased would be put in a body bag and stored in the freezer to slow down the decomposition. Yes, the same freezer that keeps the frozen food for the crew. And what do they take out of the freezer to make room? Ice cream. Back then though, during a war, it would not have made sense to bring bodies back, especially when there are a lot of deaths and there isn't enough space on a warship to hold all of them. Plus, the dead sailors wouldn't even be the priority. Helping the wounded sailors would be the most important thing. On top of that, some military historians say that storing the bodies would have made the crew less happy. So when it was possible, the bodies were wrapped in canvas and given weights by attaching 5-inch shells to them. Then there would have been a short service led by the ship's captain, and then the dead would have been laid to rest. There were last such graves during World War II, as was already said. Still, this might be one of the most dramatic pictures of a war grave at sea during the Second World War. When the Navy was putting the body to rest at sea in an airplane of Louis Edward Dean on November 15, 1944, a Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber landed safely on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Essex. The gunner didn't make it back alive, which was a shame. The anti-aircraft shells hit the plane so hard that the body couldn't be easily taken out. At that time, it was common practice to salvage airplane parts because people wanted them so much. It was told not to strip the Avenger though. Instead, they were told to bury Louis Edward Dean, 23, inside his plane. As soon as the funeral was over, sailors pushed the plane from behind the carrier. Louis is the only known U.S. Navy sailor to be purposely buried at sea with an airplane acting as a coffin. How is a burial at sea done? Today, burial at sea, the final disposition of remains that is performed on U.S. Navy ships, is allowed for the following people. Cremation, or putting the body in a coffin, are two ways to display the remains. It can be hard to spread ashes when it's windy, so it's not always done. Instead, the ashes are usually dumped at sea in boxes or containers that break down naturally. When a casket is used, burials can be a little trickier because the casket won't sink if safety precautions aren't taken. For this reason, a minimum of 2 20-inch holes have to be drilled into the coffin to allow water in to ensure that the casket will sink. Also, 150 pounds of weight must be put inside the foot of the coffin so that it sinks feet first. While the ceremony is going on, the officer of the deck tells everybody to bury the dead, and the ship stops wherever it can. All of the flags are lowered to half-mast, and everybody who's supposed to be there meets on the deck and follows a dress code. At military funerals, special pallbearers and other mourners are arranged in reverse order of rank. This is a Roman tradition that means everyone is equal when they die. The funeral flag is put on the coffin, and then either 6 or 8 people carry it to the deck. The death mask is then put on a stand so that its feet face the water. Except for one time, the body is always carried feet first. It's been said that even when they're dead, a chaplain should always face their flock, so the body of a chaplain is brought head first. Sailors lower their heads and stand at parade rest during the prayers. During the funeral service, the flag is flown over the coffin or urn. The state is responsible for the lives of its service members, as shown by this practice. After that, the flag is raised and folded 13 times. Every one of the 13 bends is important to sailors, and they do them with great care. Once the committal reading starts, and the word shown in the committal is read, The people carrying the coffin tilt the board up until the casket slides along. While the event is going on, the firing squad does a 3-volley salute, which means they fire 3 times into the air. A long ago belief said that firing 3-volley salutes would scare away bad spirits. Today, they're fired to honor the dead and show respect for their service to their country and shipmates. Taps are played at the end of the event. Tap is a bugle call that comes from the French phrase "l'extinction de feu," which means lights out. It was first played at a funeral during the Civil War instead of the 3 volleys so that the enemy wouldn't know where the gun was. It's not always necessary to be on a surface vehicle to bury somebody at sea. There are times when it can happen from a naval aircraft as the ashes of the dead are spread in the air. Instead of spreading the ashes of a person who has been cremated can be mixed into a reef ball, which is a cement combination that is safe for the environment and will start to form artificial reefs. In fact, the charity Eternal Reefs put down 67 reef balls to celebrate the crews of all 65 American submarines that have never come back and are still on eternal patrol. When we talk about submarines, if you were a submariner and wanted to do one last thing for the Navy, you could be buried at sea by submarine. In a normal situation, the ashes would be thrown overboard while the submarine is on the surface. However, a less common way is to put the ashes inside a clear torpedo tube and fire it while the boat is going underwater. For sailors who had been torpedo men, this would be a good choice. It should be clear by now that the US military really goes out of its way to celebrate its veterans. In this particular case, Frank Cabanis was buried at Pearl Harbor at the USS Arizona Memorial. After 70 years, a former Marine was reunited with his fallen friends when the memorial became his final resting place. Some bombs hit the USS Arizona on December 7, 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor. These bombs went off in the ship's hold. 1,177 sailors died. There were only 15 Marines on the ship who made it through the attack, and Frank was one of them. Divers buried the former Marine's ashes inside the hull of the sinking ship in the calm waters of Pearl Harbor so that he could be buried with his fellow soldiers who had died. Only veterans who were on the ship at the time of the attack can be buried in this special way. Project Azorian is the U.S. government's top-secret burial at sea. On September 4, 1974, there was another strange grave at sea that was kept secret for 36 years. This burial was part of the CIA's top-secret Project Azorian, which was to find the sunk Soviet submarine K-129 and bring it back to life. During the height of the Cold War, the Americans were able to get back 1/3 of the Soviet submarine. Along with nuclear-tipped torpedoes and cryptographic machines, the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners were also found during this rescue. What did they do with the bodies in the US? As they buried their enemies with full military respect, the national anthem of the Soviet Union was played and prayers were read in Russian. Throughout the years, many notable figures have been buried at sea. One such person was John Paul Jones. Although he was a Revolutionary War hero and often called the father of the American Navy, he was initially buried in Paris. Eventually, his remains were transferred to the United States. They were reinterred at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in 1913 after having been recovered from a forgotten grave in Paris. Though he wasn't buried at sea, he was eventually returned back to the New World. Franklin Roosevelt Jr. died in 1988 and was the son of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He also served as a Navy officer during World War II, and following his death, his ashes were scattered at sea by the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1988. James V. Forrestal was the first Secretary of Defense and a former Secretary of the Navy. After his tragic death in 1949, his body was buried at sea from the aircraft carrier USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. In a rare case of a civilian being buried at sea, we have Charles G. Abbott, who was an American astrophysicist and the 5th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He was buried at sea in 1973 by the U.S. Navy. Alfred Thayer Mahan was a U.S. Navy flag officer, a geostrategist and historian who was oftentimes considered one of the most important naval strategists of the 19th century. He was buried at sea in accordance with naval tradition in 1914. To most people, the idea of burial at sea is an odd one because it would remove the ability for family members and friends to pay their respects and visit a traditional gravestone at a cemetery. But to the men and women of our country who spend every day fighting and surviving to keep us all safe, to their friends, to their families, to their loved ones, they know that a burial at sea is not just a ceremony. It's a calling, it's a returning of one to the oceans from which they came. And even though these ceremonies never get any easier to perform, our hearts go out to the loved ones and to the families and friends of all of our veterans who have fought and paid the ultimate price for our freedom. God bless.